You step outside your house and something is wrong. Not with the weather, not with the harvest. Something subtler. The man coming toward you on the road speaks differently than your neighbors do. His shoes are cut differently. The cloth on his back is dyed in a way your village has never seen. You cannot be sure which state he comes from, which king sent him, or which laws he lives under. And that is the point, because the world you are living in, the world of rivers and grain fields and chalk roads connecting towns that have never heard of each other, is not one world yet. It is 7. If the title of this video caught your attention, the next 30 minutes will change how you see not just ancient China, but the very idea of what a country is, and what ordinary people lose when one disappears. Before we go any further, a quick word for those of you watching on television right now, which is most of you. If this content moves you, the single most powerful thing you can do is share this video with someone who would love it. Subscriptions matter enormously for a channel like this one. Sharing matters even more. It costs nothing and it keeps this kind of history alive. Thank you. And now let's go back. Most people, when they think of ancient China, picture one thing: a unified empire, an emperor on a throne, armies of terracotta soldiers underground, a great wall on the northern horizon. But for most of the centuries that shaped what China eventually became, none of that existed. There was no single China. There was no one emperor. There were 7 kingdoms, each with its own capital, its own currency, its own legal system, its own way of measuring a plot of farmland, its own dialect so thick that a farmer from the state of Yan in the north would have struggled to understand a merchant from the state of Chu in the south. They were not just different administrations of the same civilization. In many ways, they were different civilizations. This era, which historians call the Warring States period, lasted roughly from 475 BCE to 221 BCE, more than 2.5 centuries. Longer than the United States has been a country, longer than the entire history of the Roman Empire at its widest. And for the ordinary people who lived through it, it was simply the world, not a crisis, not a transition, just the permanent, daily fact of existing inside a system where your king might change, your borders might shift, and your neighbor's coin might be worthless in the next town over. To understand what that world actually felt like, not from generals or court philosophers, but from the ground, you have to start with the most basic question anyone asks when they arrive somewhere new. Where am I exactly? The 7 major kingdoms. Qin in the far west, along the Wei River Valley in what is now Shanxi province. Chu sprawling across the south, larger than all the others combined. Qi controlling the eastern coast around what is now Shandong. Wei sitting dangerously in the middle. Zhao anchoring the north center. Yan guarding the cold northeastern frontier. And Han, the smallest, wedged between its larger neighbors, did not exist as neat shapes on a map. Their edges were contested, patrolled, and frequently redrawn. A border was not a line. It was an argument that occasionally turned violent. Between these kingdoms ran the roads, and it is on these roads, carrying goods and letters and sometimes only yourself and your intentions, that the real texture of this world comes alive. Traveling between kingdoms required what were essentially travel documents, passes stamped by official seals, inscribed on bamboo slips or wooden tablets, establishing who you were, where you had come from, and what business you had crossing the checkpoint ahead. These were not optional. The Shuihuti bamboo slips, excavated in December 1975 from a tomb in Yunmen County, Hubei Province, the tomb of a low-ranking Qin official buried around 217 BCE, preserve fragments of the legal codes that governed this kind of movement. Crossing a border without the right documentation meant detention. Asking an inn for lodging without identification papers meant the innkeeper was legally obligated to turn you away. We know this because the reformer Shang Yang, who rebuilt Qin's legal system in the 4th century BCE, once tried to flee across the border of Wei after falling from power. He stopped at an inn to rest. The innkeeper refused him, not because he recognized him, but because his own rules required identification from every traveler seeking shelter. And Shang Yang had none. He was trapped by the very laws he had written. It is one of history's more ironic endings. Most people, of course, did not travel at all. This is the first thing that separates this world from our own. The overwhelming majority of the population lived and died within walking distance of where they were born. Their kingdom was not a political concept. It was the name of the river that flooded in summer, and the name of the tax collector who came in autumn. It was the sound of their own dialect, which marked them instantly as being from here and not from there. In the state of Chu, whose capital Ying lay in what is now the Jingzhou area of Hubei province, the spoken language carried traces of older southern traditions that would have sounded alien on the streets of Zhou's capital at Handan in Hebei. Not a different accent, a genuinely different mode of speech, different vocabulary, different poetry, different songs. The Chuchi, the songs of Chu, associated with the poet and minister Qu Yuan, who wrote from exile at the end of the 4th century BCE, survive today as one of the foundational texts of Chinese literary history. They read nothing like the poetry being composed in Qi or Zhao or Wei. They are stranger, more emotionally intense, steeped in a shamanic religious tradition that the northern states regarded as exotic and southern in ways they did not entirely understand. When Qu Yuan drowned in the Miluo River in Hunan province in an act of despair over his kingdom's failures, the date of his death became an occasion for annual remembrance. What is now the Dragon Boat Festival has outlasted the kingdom that produced him by more than 2,000 years. Languages alone were enough to make the warring states' world feel like what it was. A collection of distinct places that had arrived at coexistence and mutual antagonism without having planned it. What kept these kingdoms from simply absorbing each other decade after decade was a system so elaborate and so fragile that it is almost impossible to describe without sounding like invention. The Warring States period was governed by diplomacy as much as by war. And the diplomacy was something the world had never quite seen before and has never quite seen since. At the heart of it were two competing ideas. One said, the 6 kingdoms that face the growing power of Qin in the west should form a vertical alliance, linking north to south, presenting a common front. Its adherents called this Heizong, the vertical alignment. The other idea said, each kingdom should seek its own relationship with Qin, bargaining for land and peace and hoping its neighbors would absorb the brunt of Qin's expansion instead. This was Lianheng, the horizontal connection. These were not abstractions. They were the bread and butter politics of real courts, real rooms, real conversations between men who knew that saying the wrong thing to the wrong king on the wrong day could end in their death. And they were advanced by a class of people this era invented, and no comparable moment in history has quite replicated: the itinerant political strategist. These men had no fixed loyalty to any single kingdom. They traveled between courts, carrying only their arguments and their reputations. They were fed by their hosts, given silk robes and jade pendants, granted private audiences with rulers who might otherwise have spent years behind ceremonial walls. They offered something no general could offer: the chance to win without fighting. Gong Sun Yan, known by his honorific as Rhinoceros Head, was among the earliest great architects of the vertical alliance in the 4th century BCE. He managed to draw Wei, Zhao, Han, and Yan into a coalition against Qin, a remarkable achievement given how thoroughly those states had been attacking each other just years before. The coalition did not hold, but the template was set. Zhang Yi arrived to dismantle it. A native of Wei who entered the service of Qin, Zhang Yi became one of the most feared diplomatic operators of the entire period. He traveled into the courts of kingdoms that resented Qin, including Chu, and made promises. Some he kept, others he did not. According to Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, Zhang Yi once traveled to Chu at the king's personal invitation after surviving a severe beating at the hands of a Chu official who suspected him of theft during a banquet. He returned from that beating, asked his wife only whether his tongue was still intact, and when she confirmed it was, told her that as long as his tongue existed, that was enough. His tongue proved sufficient to unravel one of the largest anti-Qin coalitions ever assembled, convincing the Chu king that Qin would hand over more than 600 li of territory in exchange for Chu breaking from its allies. Qin never delivered the territory. By the time Chu understood what had happened, its alliances had collapsed and could not be rebuilt. Zhang Yi ultimately died in Wei around 310 BCE, the damage done. Su Qin, the other great name of this era, came somewhat later, despite centuries of tradition claiming he and Zhang Yi were direct rivals who had studied together. Bamboo manuscripts unearthed from Han Dynasty tombs at Mawangdui in Changsha in 1973 changed this picture significantly, suggesting that Su Qin's active career came roughly a generation after Zhang Yi's death. What is verifiable is that Su Qin, born near what is now Luoyang in Henan province, spent years traveling between courts before finding his opening. He returned home after his early travels having achieved nothing, so depleted in resources and status that by his own account, his family barely acknowledged him. He locked himself in a room to study, reportedly stabbing his thigh with a sharp implement when he felt himself falling asleep over his texts, a practice that became embedded in Chinese cultural memory as an emblem of desperate determination. When he finally succeeded, persuading the rulers of 6 kingdoms to align against Qin and reportedly carrying the seals of all 6 states simultaneously, his family received him on his return with the kind of reverence previously reserved for strangers whose importance they had failed to recognize. These men gave the warring states period much of its drama, but the ordinary people around them gave it its texture. Consider what it meant to live in a kingdom that shared a border with another, not as a soldier or diplomat, but as a farmer with a field that happened to lie near a road that troops used. The logistical demands of warring states' warfare were enormous and fell disproportionately on those least able to bear them. A passage preserved in historical sources captures this with stark clarity. If a war is fought in winter, it will be too cold. If in summer, too hot. If in spring, it pulls people away from sowing. If in fall, from harvesting. There was no good season to fight a war if you were the one being conscripted to fight it, or the one watching your farm go to seed while your neighbors marched away. The scale of armies during this period was unlike anything the region had previously seen. The Battle of Changping in 260 BCE, fought in what is now Shanxi province between Qin and Zhao, involved combined forces estimated at well over 500,000 men. Zhao lost an army of around 450,000. Qin's casualties exceeded 200,000. The Qin general Bai Qi, who had defeated the Zhao forces and accepted their surrender, faced a dilemma for which there was no clean answer. He could not feed his prisoners, could not trust them, could not release them to fight again. He ordered them killed. Mass burial sites connected to this battle have been excavated near Gaiyuping in Shanxi, where thousands of skeletal remains, many showing signs of execution, were found in pits that had been waiting underground for more than 2,000 years. Archaeology confirmed what the historical texts described, what Changping meant for the people of Zhao, the families in Handan who waited for news, the households whose members had marched south and never returned, is not something the historical records discuss in detail. The generals and kings are named. The mathematics of slaughter is recorded. The grief is not. Trade between the kingdoms never stopped, even during periods of open war. Merchants carrying silk out of Qi's coastal workshops, salt from the great eastern deposits, iron tools forged in Han and Wei, bronze lacquerware from Chu's artisan centers. These goods moved along roads that had existed for generations, following routes no king's declaration could erase. Markets in border towns did what markets always do. They found a way, but the coinage problem was real and maddening. Each kingdom minted its own money. Qi used a round coin with a square hole. Zhao and Han issued spade-shaped coins. Yan used a knife-shaped currency. its blade an abstract descendant of the actual bronze knives that earlier traders had carried. Qu used something altogether different: small bronze coins modeled on the shape of ancient cowrie shells. A merchant crossing from Qi into Yan did not just cross a border. He crossed into a place where everything he was carrying, his prices, his calculations, his entire mental framework for the value of things, became temporarily worthless. He had to find a money changer, trust that person's exchange rate, and accept that he would lose something in the transaction, whether he understood the rate or not. This was not an accident. Distinct currency was one of the ways each kingdom maintained its economic identity. A farmer in Zhao who paid his taxes in spade-shaped bronze and owed debts recorded under Zhao law had very little practical incentive to dream of a unified empire. The world he lived in had a logic to it, even when that logic was frustrating. The world also had hostages. One of the most normalized but least discussed practices of warring states' diplomacy was the exchange of royal family members between kingdoms as guarantors of treaties. When two states signed a pact, the weaker party typically sent a prince to live in the stronger state's capital until the treaty held or broke. This was presented in diplomatic language as an honor. The prince would be housed well, given access to education, exposed to another culture. In practice, it was a polite form of leverage. A Qu prince living in Qin, according to the historical record, once killed a Qin patrician and fled, setting off a political disruption that unraveled an entire cycle of alliances. Qin Shi Huang himself, the man who would one day unify all of this, spent his early years in the Zhao capital of Handan as exactly such a hostage. His father, a minor Qin prince named Zichu, had been sent to Handan as part of a diplomatic arrangement, and the future first emperor was born there. The Shiji suggests his early years were difficult, marked by the social precariousness of being a foreigner in a city that had no particular reason to treat the Qin hostage family well when relations between Qin and Zhao deteriorated. It is one of history's more extraordinary reversals. The man who would erase Handan as a Zhao city had once been a resident dependent on its charity. Crown Prince Dan of Yan had a similar experience. Sent as a hostage to Qin in his youth, housed in Shang Yang, while Yan and Qin maintained their carefully managed relationship. What he did next is one of the Warring States period's most dramatic moments. He sought out a man named Jing Ke and sent him to Xianyang with a mission to assassinate the Qin king in 227 BCE, using a map of Yan's territory as the pretext for getting close enough to act. Jing Ke failed. The king survived. The army that marched on Yan afterward was larger and angrier than anything Yan could have prepared for. King Shi of Yan, in a final act of diplomatic humiliation, handed his own son's severed head to Qin's generals in 226 BCE in an attempt to buy peace. It bought very little. The Qin diplomatic machine did not always work through violence. Some of its most effective operations worked through money. Before each conquest, Qin sent agents into the courts of target kingdoms with gold and instructions to find ministers who could be persuaded to work against their own state's interests. Ministers who accepted were sometimes caught and executed. But the accusation and execution were themselves problems. Removing a capable minister on the basis of suspicion, even warranted suspicion, weakened the apparatus the kingdom needed to resist Qin. Qin exploited this deliberately. In Zhao, the capable General Li Mu, who had successfully held off Qin's advances, was falsely accused of treason through Qin's instigation of court rumors. His own king removed him from command. He was replaced. Zhao never successfully resisted Qin again. The people living through all of this had no way of knowing they were approaching an end. The merchants adjusting their prices for the knife coin market in Yan's capital at Ji, near present-day Beijing, were not thinking about unification. The farmers in Wei's capital at Daliang, which lay near what is today Kaifeng in Henan province, were not anticipating the day when Qin engineers would divert the channels of the Yellow River to flood the city walls. They were thinking about the harvest. about the tax due in spring, about whether the road to the next market town had been repaired. This ordinariness of daily life running alongside historical catastrophe is one of the most important things to understand about this period. The kingdoms did not feel like they were dying. They felt like they were enduring, with difficulty, with improvisation, with the assumption that whatever had been true yesterday would roughly be true tomorrow. The walls of Linzi in Shandong, capital of Qi, were among the most impressive urban fortifications in the ancient world, and the city behind them held a population estimated at close to 750,000 people. Its markets traded in salt from coastal production centers, silk from regional workshops, iron tools, dried fish. The Jixia Academy, which had operated there since around the 360s BCE, hosted philosophers from every major school of thought: Confucians, Taoists, followers of Mozi, thinkers who defied easy categorization, who came to debate each other in front of an audience that included the Qi court itself. It was one of the most extraordinary intellectual institutions the ancient world produced. A place where the disagreements of the age were argued in words rather than settled with armies. None of this made Qi feel like a place about to cease to exist. Handan, Zhao's capital in present-day Hebei province, had its own ambitions. The Kongtai platform, built by King Wuling of Zhao, who reigned from 325 to 299 BCE, still stands in the city today, preserved inside what is now Kongtai Park. You can visit it, walk around it, stand on ground that people in the 4th century BCE stood on. King Wuling is the ruler who ordered his armies to abandon traditional chariot-based warfare in favor of cavalry tactics adopted from the nomadic peoples along Zhao's northern border. He also required them to wear the short-sleeved belted tunics of the steppe, rather than the wide-sleeved ceremonial garments that identified them as civilized men of the Zhou world. His ministers and nobles objected. He overruled them. The reform worked. Zhao's cavalry became one of the most effective forces of the period, at least until Changping. And in the far west, Qin's capital at Xianyang in Shanxi province was building something different. The administrative apparatus that Shang Yang had designed, a system that registered every household, assigned every individual to a productive role, and tied advancement to documented achievement in farming or warfare rather than to birth, was creating a state that functioned more like a machine than like any of the others. There was less room for the philosophical debate of Linzi's Jixia Academy, less room for the aristocratic negotiation that characterized politics in Wei and Zhao. Qin kept records. It measured grain. It tracked bodies through household registration documents that told the state how many able-bodied adults lived in each unit, what they owed in labor, and what they would owe if called to fight. For those inside Qin who had nothing, this system offered at least the theoretical possibility of a different kind of life. A soldier who brought back a head from battle, documented, verified, earned a specific legal rank, not a promise, an entitlement recorded on bamboo, enforceable. For a man with no land and no family connections in a world that still prized aristocratic birth, this was genuinely new. For the kingdoms that Qin would eventually consume, it was a model of state power they had never quite imagined. The wars that ended the multi-kingdom world came quickly, by the standards of how long that world had existed. Han fell first, in 230 BCE. Zhao fell in 228 BCE. Wei fell in 225 BCE. Its capital at Daliang drowned when Qin engineers redirected river channels to flood the walls. An act so total that the city eventually disappeared entirely under centuries of silt, its ruins lying beneath modern Kaifeng. Chu, the largest, required a force of 600,000 soldiers under the general Wang Jian, and 4 years of campaigning before its last king was captured at Shaochun in Anhui in 223 BCE. Yan surrendered in 222 BCE. Shi, systematically isolated for years, fell in 221 BCE without significant resistance. In 9 years, a world that had existed for 2.5 centuries was gone. But gone is not quite the right word. The territories did not disappear. The people did not disappear. The rivers and fields and roads did not disappear. What disappeared was the idea that this place was distinct, that its laws were its own, that the coin in your pocket was the coin of your kingdom, that the accent in your voice announced something meaningful about where you belonged. All of that was replaced by decree. One script, one set of weights and measures, one axle width for carts so the roads could be standardized, one emperor whose title had never before existed in Chinese history. The people who had grown up checking their travel papers at border posts, converting their currencies, noting which customs applied on which side of a river. They now lived in a world where those borders did not exist anymore. Whether that felt like liberation or like loss depended entirely on who you were and what you had owned under the old system. For those who had held noble rank, local authority, a family name that carried meaning in a specific place, the empire was a diminishment. For those who had owned nothing, the empire's meritocracy offered at least the possibility of something different. What is certain is that the plurality is gone. The knife coins and the spade coins and the cowrie-shaped bronze of Chu were melted down and recast. The distinct scripts of each kingdom were replaced by the Qin script. The Jixia Academy, where philosophers had argued for generations about the right way to live, was never reopened. The multi-kingdom world did not survive long enough to mourn itself, and the people inside it, farmers and merchants and innkeepers and border guards and hostage princes and itinerant strategists with only their tongues to protect them, moved forward into a world that had been decided for them by forces building for decades on the other side of a mountain pass, in a capital city most of them had never seen. History remembers the empire. It tends to forget the seven, and yet the seven is where most of the living was done. The debates, the currencies, the border crossings, the courts full of philosophers arguing about whether the world should be governed by virtue or by law. All of it happened not in the empire, but in the complicated, dangerous, astonishingly productive world that existed before it. That world lasted longer than most empires ever do. It produced art and philosophy and military innovation and poetry that China still reads. And it ended not because it failed, but because one of its members grew powerful enough to absorb the rest. That is not a story of a world dying. It is a story of a world being swallowed. And if this is what it looked like from the outside, from the border posts and the market towns, and the ordinary households on the wrong side of a Qin general's route, the next question is stranger still. What did it feel like from the inside, in the months and years after the swallowing was complete? What did ordinary life look like inside the empire that replaced everything? That is the story waiting just ahead.